The Orbison family for a long, long time has been very active in the service of our Lord and have done so much good. Brother Jack Orbison, who just led our prayer, is an uncle of Guy, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we honored him here at the Fort Worth Lectureship along with Eddie Parker and one other, because they started the Truth and Love television back in 1983. And it has grown and prospered and done so much good for the cause of Christ. And so, Jack, we were happy to have you. Brother Guy Orbison Sr. used to preach in Nocona, Texas. He followed me there, and I had preached there, and so I feel like I know the family real well. And Brother Guy Orbison Jr. is no stranger to us because he's been on this lectureship at least 2 other times that I can think of, and perhaps even 3, and is such a distinguished gentleman and has done so much good for the cause of Christ. He was born in Dallas, so he hasn't strayed too far, at least for tonight anyway, but he has preached the gospel in Texas and Minnesota and Colorado. Most of us have a fixation on him being in Durango, and there's good cause for that because he's been there a long time, about 23 or 24 years, and a lot of people from Brown Trail vacation in Colorado, and numbers of us have gone to Durango on Sunday to be able to worship God and have heard Guy Orbison preach there, and he always does such a splendid job. He's married to Mary Rowe, and they've been married for 41 years, and they have 3 children and 1 grandchild. Guy received his bachelor's degree and his master's degree from Abilene Christian University, the latest being the Master of Divinity degree. And he also is very muchly involved in a publication, a monthly journal called Working in the Word. And that group of preachers that participate in that also have an annual retreat for preachers called Workshop in the Word. And of course, Guy is the one that's in charge of that. We're happy to have him with us tonight. He's got a wonderful subject, the greatness of God. And I know that he'll do a splendid job. And we welcome Guy with us. We're happy to have you, dear brother. And preach the word.
Preach the word. Thank you. That was one of my graduates back there. I bring you greetings from Colorado, or what we like to call Tim Tebow country. I tell you, we have Bronco mania in Colorado, and we couldn't hardly believe that we got into the playoffs and then beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. We've got the Patriots coming up, but folks, in Colorado we say you just got to believe. Do you have a football team in the area that you can get excited about? I guess not. What a joy to be back with you. I appreciate the opportunity, the elders taking a chance on me, and Maxie as well, putting up with me again. And it's good to see the black box again. Several speakers have mentioned the black box. If we crash and burn tonight, I hope they find the black box. Then they'll know what happened. Orbison went overtime. I don't need the black box. I welcome the black box because my grandfather on my mother's side had a different kind of signal for preaching. He was really a house painter, but I called him a frustrated preacher from all the stories that I've heard about him. I was much too little to actually have listened to him preach. But he never got too many opportunities to preach, but every occasion that he could, he took the opportunity, and he would make up for lost time by preaching just as long as he wanted to. Kind of runs in the family, Maxie. So my grandmother took him aside one Sunday morning when he was scheduled to preach, and she said, "Now, Charles, you know you talk too long. So I have a signal for you." It wasn't a little black box. She said, "I have in my pocket here a hanky. And when I pull out the hanky, that's the time for you to bring it to a close." And I can imagine my grandfather saying, "Yes, dear," or whatever, under his breath. Well, as he was preaching, the appropriate time came, and out came the hanky. And he totally ignored my grandmother. So she stuffed it back in her pocket and pulled it out again. And he totally ignored my grandmother. And so she began to sort of flip it around a little bit. And he totally ignored my grandmother. And so finally, she's waving it with great fashion. And I know I was small when I heard the story, but I envisioned her standing on the pew like one of those guys on the carriers bringing in the airplanes, coming in to tell my grandfather it's time to quit. So I welcomed the black box. It's a lot easier than grandmother standing on the pew. Now, if Maxie gets up on the pew, I'll know I'm in trouble. We're going to turn to chapter 11 of Romans. The text assigned to me is chapter 11, verses 33 through 36. My grandfather preached from the King James Version. My dad liked to study from the American Standard Version. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version. This is the one Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. I don't know why you picked the version you do. Let's listen carefully to the word from God. Oh, the depth of the riches of both the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor? Or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. We call this a doxology. And generally, when you see a doxology from Paul, it follows a doctrinal section, and he just can't help himself but to send forth praise unto God. And that's what a doxology is. It's a word of praise. With this text, Paul has reached the pinnacle of his instruction. Romans is easily divided into two sections. The first 11 chapters are all doctrinal. And the next 5 chapters, from 12 through 16, those are practical in nature. And in the first 11 chapters, Paul begins at the ground level and initiates a mountain climb, a journey up the side of a mountain. And he wants to take his readers to the top of a theological mountain. He wanted them to see something that might be difficult for the common man to see. And you can only see it and appreciate it from the peak. And he's led his readers in the climb up to the apex of God's great scheme of redemption. He began with the ground level truth that all men are sinners and in need of salvation. That's chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then he slowly and methodically ascended upward to show his readers that salvation cannot be based on works of law. You cannot earn or merit your salvation. It is based only on faith in Christ Jesus, chapters 4 and 5. And then he had them climb higher to see that in order for anyone to be free of the slavery of sin and to enjoy a holy relationship with God, each one had to die to his old ways and to his old life in order to have the new life that God intended for us. Chapters 6, 7, and 8. And the last leg of the journey, the apostle working his way up the difficult slopes of understanding the rejection of Israel and the acceptance of the Gentiles, he leads his readers to the very top of the mountain of God's plan to save man in chapters 9, 10, and 11. And he brings his theological, his doctrinal discussion to a conclusion in chapter 11 in verse 32. And he's now at the mountain peak of his teaching in the passage that we've just read. In the last 5 chapters, Paul makes his descent down from the mountaintop, issuing warnings and instruction as to how his readers must live in view of what they've seen in the climb to the mountaintop. And so he begins in chapter 12 by saying, "Therefore, I urge you or beseech you by the mercies of God that you are to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice." The way we live is dependent on what we have seen and learned as we climb upward to the pinnacle of God's plan to save man. And so Paul continues the descent down the mountain, showing his readers at each level of altitude what's required of them. They are not to be arrogant. They are to use their gifts in serving one another. That's chapter 12, verses 3 through 8. They are to be of the same mind toward one another and never seek revenge. Chapter 12, verses 9 through 21. They are to subject themselves to the governing authorities and to pay their taxes on April the 15th with a smile. Chapter 13, just read it. And they are to accept one another in spite of their differences, the differing opinions that they might carry with them. Chapter 14. And they are to get along with one another in spite of the fact that they have differing races, differing backgrounds, and differing cultures from which they came. And then at the end of chapter 15, Paul finally comes back down to ground level in declaring his plans to go to Rome and then on to Spain. And then in chapter 16, he sends a picture postcard with greetings to so many people in the congregation in Rome from so many people who surround him there in Corinth. One of the great privileges that I have living in Colorado is the blessing of being able to get out and climb a mountain every once in a while. And so it's easy for me to make the analogy of climbing with the reading of this Roman letter. And when we read Romans, we follow the great Apostle Paul, who acts as our trail guide in leading us up to the top of this spiritual mountain. But the climbing of a mountain peak is never easy. It's difficult. The terrain is difficult to negotiate. A few years ago, a friend of mine, Larry McKesson, and I decided to climb Engineer Mountain, about 20 miles north of Durango. And we started at 5 in the morning and worked our way through the forest and following the trail all the way up, partial way to the mountain, got above timberline, well above 10 or 11,000 feet, and at about 12,000 feet, we reached the last leg of the journey where it was the peak that we were to climb. And when we got there, we sat down and rested. And Larry looked up and he said, "Man, that sure is steep." And I said, "Larry, you know, we brought our lunches and we planned to eat at the top, but we could eat it right here and just go home afterwards." And Larry said, "Man, that sure is steep." I said, "Larry, you know, we could just go home and tell our wives we went to the top. We don't have to really go." And Larry said, "Man, that sure is steep." And I said, "Larry, I don't have to prove my manhood by going up there. We nearly talked ourselves out of it. But we finally mustered the courage and worked our way up the final leg of the journey and stood at 13,000 feet on top. And my, what a view. Those who make it to the top of a mountain know that you don't immediately start your descent. After the effort of the climb, the mountain man takes a moment to admire the view that few people are privileged to see. At the top of the mountain, you make a memory on your mind that you carry with you for the rest of your life. And in like manner, Paul here in chapter 11 could have ended at verse 32 and immediately begun writing chapter 12 as he begins his descent down the mountain. But he doesn't embark on coming down the mountain immediately. It has been with some effort that he brought us up to the peak. And so in these verses that we've read, in these verses that divide the doctrinal from the practical, the climb from the descent, Paul lingers a moment to let us take it all in. And he writes these words. This is a doxology that's a study in threes. And in verse 33, Paul does three things. He gives three exclamations of praise for God's greatness. And the first one is simply the word, oh. Oh. Just one word. And with that one word, Paul presents, I think, the culmination of all that he has seen in the theological climb to the mountaintop of God's plan to save man. The English word, oh, is used sometimes to express a range of emotions, such as surprise, or even anger, or disappointment, or maybe even joy. But here, when Paul writes the word oh, he means for us to understand a sense of amazement and wonder. The original Greek word is just one letter. It's the omega in the nominative case. But that one letter speaks volumes. It's as if Paul comes to the edge of the mountaintop and he looks back over the climb that brought him to this point, and he takes in the entire view. And in one swoop of emotion, he exclaims, oh, my, that's really something, isn't it, what God has done? The second exclamation of praise has to do with the very nature of God when Paul speaks of the depth of the riches of both his wisdom and knowledge. And Paul uses this expression, depth of riches, to describe how inexhaustible are the wisdom and the knowledge of our God. These riches are the wealth of God's wisdom and knowledge that could never be spent fully. They run so deep that no one could ever reach the bottom in probing the very knowledge and the wisdom of God. They are a pair. They go together. God's wisdom is his insight, and it's his perspective of the world. His wisdom does not conform to the standards of human wisdom. He sees the reality of things as they really are, things that man cannot see unless they are revealed to him by God. And so God's insight at times may appear to mortal man to even be illogical. God sent his Son, but he did not send him as a great emperor. He did not elevate him to an earthly kingship, but rather he brought him in as a lowly bondservant. He came not to be lifted up as an earthly ruler, but to be lifted up on a cross to die as a sacrifice for sins. And it's only by reflecting on God's wisdom in sending his Son that you and I come to realize it is the only way that he could have accomplished our salvation. And we have to stretch our minds to comprehend such a plan as God devised for us. And so surely we understand his wisdom runs deep. And his knowledge consists of all things that are objects of knowledge. God knows the end from the beginning. And at any moment, he can see all things, whether it be present or past or future. His knowledge runs deep. The third exclamation of praise has to do with our own inability to ferret out God's wisdom and understanding. Paul proclaims how unsearchable are his judgments, how unfathomable are his ways. This word unsearchable is from a Greek term that appears only here in the New Testament. And it means that it's impossible for us to get a full comprehension of God's judgments or his decisions. The more we seek to know why God determined what he did, we may gain some insight, but we will never probe every facet of his resolve. They are unsearchable. The word unfathomable suggests that his ways or his actions are incapable of being fully explored. And this word comes from a Greek term that literally refers to footprints that are untrackable. And it's used in secular Greek in the first century to refer to an animal that a hunter was unable to track. You just cannot track out what he's done. We prefer in the English the word unfathomable because it suggests that we are unable to probe fully the depth of all of God's ways, his actions. It's impossible, what Paul is saying here, to measure the depth to which God has gone to bring us to freedom from sin. Next, in verses 34 and 35, there are three questions that emphasize God's greatness. And these questions are rhetorical questions, and they come to us from a quotation or an adaptation from Old Testament texts. They're not questions seeking information, but rather they're emphasizing the inability of anyone to fully comprehend the Lord's decisions. Each question demands the same answer, and the answer is no one. They're designed to impress upon us the greatness of God by comparison to any human being. And someday when you get full of yourself, this might be a text that you should revisit. And so the first question is, who has known the mind of the Lord? That's taken from Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 13. And the answer, of course, is no one has known the mind of the Lord. The question is really asking if anyone could have conceived of the plan and the manner in which God carried out the plan to save mankind. And no one would have ever dreamed up, no one would have ever thought that a man dying on a cross some 2,000 years ago would be the means God would employ to secure our hope of everlasting life. Paul told the Corinthians that the world wrestles with this idea of the cross. And he said to them that the word of the cross is really, to those who are perishing, nothing but foolishness. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 18. In other words, the scheme of redemption that God conceived runs contrary to the thinking of the world. No man, then, could have known what was in the mind of the Lord until God finally revealed it in the sending of his Son, Jesus Christ. But even after he sent Jesus, even then, after God has revealed his mind, his way of thinking, his plan for redemption, most people still refuse to accept his thinking because it goes contrary to their own agendas and way of thinking. The second question that Paul asks here in verse 34 is, who became his counselor? And this is also taken from Isaiah chapter 40, but verse 14. And the answer again, no one. And the question, I think, points to the idea that God is wiser than any man. If God had sought counseling from any man on how to save mankind, then that would imply that perhaps others had comparable wisdom to God, or maybe superior wisdom to God. But when God devised the means of saving us, he did not need to ask the advice of anyone. And yet, throughout the ages, there have been people who have judged God's plan and his way of thinking as being wrong. And so Paul noted to the Corinthians that the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks search for wisdom. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 22. In other words, both Jews and Greeks rejected God's plan because it was not in line with their own counsel or their own way of thinking. It is true that the Jews looked for the promised Messiah, but the kind and gentle spirit of Jesus did not meet with their vision of the Messiah. They wanted to see the signs of a militant general who would ride in on a white horse and rally the troops of Israel against the Romans and overthrow the Romans and restore the kingdom to the glory days of David and Solomon. And Jesus did not meet their Jewish expectation. They had their own ideas about religion, and so they rejected God's ideas. In like manner, the Greeks were into intellectual reasoning, searching for wisdom, what measures up to human wisdom. And so the idea of just one God was offensive to them, and a religion that followed a weak man who was impaled on a Roman cross was beyond their comprehension. They had their own ideas about religion, and these did not coincide with those of God's eternal plan. Paul is saying here that since no man could have conceived what God was up to from the very beginning of creation, and since the world has always had other ideas about how to do religion, no man could have counseled God in what he determined to do. God alone devised the only possible means by which to bring sinful man into a holy and righteous relationship with himself. And the third question is found in verse 35. And Paul asks this: who was first, or who has first given to him that it may be paid back to him again? And that's taken from either Job 35 or 41. And again, the implied response is no one has given anything to God. And this question points to the truth that God is beholding to no one, and that God needs nothing from anyone who might think that they could offer him something. God is self-existent. God is self-sustaining in the universe. He needs nothing from anyone else. And since God is the one who brought us forth, who gave us the entire created order, and gave man his existence, then what could the lesser give to the greater? Being the creation of God, we are beholding to him and not the other way round. And so Paul's point may be that God is not obligated to do things our way, yet we are obligated, I think, to submit ourselves, to accept the things that he has given us in accordance with his thinking and his plans. We did not advise him on religion, and since we could not possibly have come up with the plan that he devised, then what he chooses to do is not based on any obligation to us. We gave him nothing. And God has never been required to do what he did for us. We never deserved to receive what God has offered to us. It is love that obligated him to us. The third thing that Paul does is in verse 36. And we have a threefold affirmation of God's greatness given here. In this last verse, Paul affirms with great brevity the basic facts of the greatness of our God. In my version, it begins with the word for, which could be translated from the original as because, and it suggests that here is the reason why no one could advise God and why God is not obligated to anyone. Just 6 words. From him, through him, to him. In those words, Paul presents the greatness of God in relation to the whole creation. These 6 words have to do with what Paul calls all things, a neuter plural in the Greek. All things refers to the totality of what exists other than God. We may say that it refers to all that is in the universe or within the whole creation, whether it be material or spiritual in nature. It's everything that is a thing other than God himself. All things. And so the threefold affirmation, all things are from God, from him. They have their source in God. Before God spoke everything into existence, nothing existed alongside God. Everything that exists owes its existence to God, from angels to rocks. All have been created by God. All things are from him. Therefore, God is never obligated to anything or any person, but all things and persons are therefore obligated to God. They owe their very existence to him. But not only are all things from him, Paul says all things are through him. All things have their continued existence because of God. God is the medium or the means by which everything continues. Just as God spoke everything into existence, one word from him could remove everything that exists. And one day that word will be given, and it will all be gone. All things continue at the pleasure of God. And some men today may be arrogant enough to think that we humans can destroy this world, whether it be by atomic bombs or aerosol cans that you spray. They think we may destroy the world, but in reality, it is only the God who made the world that will bring this world to an end. All things will continue through him until he's determined that he's done. Not only are all things from him and all things are through him, but Paul says all things are to him. All things have their ultimate end in our God. He is the goal. He is the reason for the existence of all things. God has an objective in mind for bringing all things into being and for maintaining their existence as long as they exist. And his ultimate goal is to have objects of love for eternity. And the Hebrew writer succinctly states it this way: he wants to bring many sons to glory. Hebrews 2 and verse 10. Everything created and sustained by his power is designed to accomplish this one end. God is the objective of all things. He is the end of which all things exist. There is no purpose for the existence of everything except the one purpose that God has for himself. All material things exist to sustain and promote the human race. The world exists for man because God is after the spirits of men. Thus, it is for his ultimate purpose that all things have existence. They are from him, they are through him, and ultimately they are to him. Is it any wonder that Paul proclaims in verse 36, "To him be the glory forever"? The word glory does not mean or attribute a characteristic or attribute of God, but rather it is giving all honor and praise to our Creator. And when the human mind begins to weigh in on who God is and what he has accomplished, then the natural response would be to bow the knee and lift the voice in praise to our Creator and our Redeemer. And Paul adds, amen. He adds, amen. A seal of approval given by the one who has said it. It denotes the idea that the writer or the speaker is convicted about what has just been written. He's saying, that's the truth. You can take it to the bank. I like the view from the mountaintop. And the view from the mountain peak enables us to see more than we could ever see from ground level. The higher you can climb, the more you will see. And the higher you can climb in understanding the text that God has put into our hands, enables you to see and to understand more of the greatness of our God. On September the 3rd in the year 1941, there was a young fighter pilot. His name was John Gillespie McGee, Jr. And he was testing a new model of the Spitfire. And he took that plane upward to an altitude above 30,000 feet. He had never been that high before. And when he reached that height, he was overcome by thoughts of God, and a poem began to form in his mind. And when he returned to the airfield, he immediately found paper and pen, and he began to write down his thoughts. And the poem, High Flight, was the result. The sad note to this young man was that it wasn't long after that he was involved in giving his life for his country. And they were gathering up the remains of his belongings to send to his folks, and this poem was among those things that they found. And I think in his grief, his dad published this poem. And I like this poem because it begins just as Paul began this doxology with the one word, oh, and he adds an exclamation point after it. And here's what he wrote. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter, silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence, hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark nor ever eagle flew, and where with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Oh, what marvelous mercy, what infinite love, what immeasurable grace I see. By his blood I am cleansed, I am happy and free, through his suffering on Calvary. Oh, the riches and depth of such wonderful love, flowing boundless and full and free. And the debt on the cross for my sins was all paid in his suffering on